This podcast is made possible by you, the supporters of WPLN and WNXP, Nashville Public Radio.
It's January 1st, 2025. Happy New Year. I'm Miriam Kramer, and you're listening to the last of our special holiday editions of the NashVillager podcast from Nashville Public Radio, WPLN News. You don't often hear my voice, but I have the distinct pleasure of helping to bring you this podcast each weekday. I'm Nina Cardona's editor, so I'm the lucky person that gets to read each of her On This Day essays first. And when I say lucky, I mean it. I grew up in Tennessee, and Nina's essays have changed the way I see my home state. I am constantly learning from them. Remember her essay just a couple of weeks ago about Fort Negley and the neighborhoods around it? That was a talking point with my husband while the kids slept in the back seat on a long drive from Florida last week. How about her explanation of state and local sales taxes? I had no idea how that worked, but now I definitely do. What about TVA and its nuclear ambitions, or Superfund sites around the state? Nina has a unique ability as a journalist to help you see our world in a new way because of her deep knowledge of our state and its history. And she's at her best when she's connecting the dots. Today, we're going to highlight 3 of Nina's On This Day essays that do this particularly well. Our first is from back on October 30th. Nina used the anniversary of that infamous Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast, which caused some listeners to panic, thinking there was a real alien invasion going on, as a way to explain how our newsroom picks the stories we tell. Here's Nina.
The War of the Worlds hysteria was a definite lesson for the broadcast industry. There is power in any content or product that gets that kind of mass distribution. We've got to be careful in how we present things to make clear what is fact and what is fiction. Now, I wish I could say that every broadcast news entity still took that seriously. I think we all have our doubts, to say the least, about some. I've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks sitting at the bedside of a family member who likes to have cable news on all the time. And let's just say it's definitely given me a lot to think about in terms of journalism, the standards of this industry, and the continued power of the press. So now it seems like a good time to pull back the curtain a little bit and tell you how things work in the WPLN newsroom. Our goal here, day in and day out, is to place an emphasis on turning out reporting that is nuanced, fact-based, and most importantly, community-driven. We focus on the big picture. There's a difference in quality and importance between news reports that do little more than scare you about a situation that is highly unusual and individual, and one that shines a light on the way things are going in the community as a whole. We're always going to push for that second category. We place a high value on revealing systemic issues and telling the stories of the people working to fix them. Our reporters question people and institutions that are in power and elevate the voices of people most impacted. The underlying thought through everything we do here is that there's a real value in connecting the dots. And our hope is that you walk away from our coverage feeling that we've contextualized the news of the day in a way that deepens your understanding and empowers you to get involved in the larger community. As for the nuts and bolts of how that happens, well, as our newsroom has grown, we have been able to really invest in a strong core of editors. These are people whose voices you don't hear as often, but they work hand in hand with reporters to plan coverage, to think through the way each story is told, and then to carefully check each draft to make sure the news we're sharing is accurate, understandable, and engaging. In some cases, for major investigations, WPLN reporters like Miriam Knight or Paige Flager work with outside organizations like ProPublica, NPR, or the Serial podcast team to tap into an even more robust crew of folks like editors and fact checkers. More and more, our reporters specialize in beats, like Caroline Eggers working exclusively on environmental stories, Catherine Sweeney focusing on healthcare, or Cynthia Abrams covering metro government. That means they can become experts in their subject areas. When a government official issues some kind of statement that pertains to their beat, they already know the context and can hit the ground running. And they're also in a great position to recognize and cut through the BS when someone's trying to spin things in a way that's less than truthful. And we're reading everyone else's reporting too. That's part of my job as the local host of Morning Edition. Every day after I look through the reports that are ready for air from our own team, I also look at all the other news outlets around town to see what they're saying. Partly that's to see if there's anything we missed, but it's also to get a sense of what their reporters picked up on in stories that we all covered. Because as hard as we try to get the full story ourselves, there's always that chance that someone else noticed another detail that's also important. And we're always interested in rounding out our coverage so that what makes it to your ears is the most complete and most relevant as we can make it.
Nina also pulls from her rich understanding of our state's history for her essays. And because of that deep knowledge, she can truly tell it like it is. Here's our second of Nina's essays from August 28th. It's about Nathan Bedford Forrest, who she describes as the Confederate ghost who won't stop haunting Middle Tennessee.
Around here, anytime there's a statue or a bust or a named building that becomes a point of contention between people wanting to cleanse the Confederate stain and those wanting to keep the Confederacy alive, the name or likeness in question is probably his. In large part, that's because he's the local guy. Robert E. Lee was a wealthy Virginia planter who went to West Point, but Forrest was born dirt poor in Chapel Hill, Tennessee, a small town on the banks of the Duck River. He left to find his fortune in Memphis, trading enslaved people. During the Civil War, he roamed around much of Middle and West Tennessee, acting like the military equivalent of a mosquito, using guerrilla tactics to sting the Union with small bites here, there, and everywhere, but never really trusted with serious command. And the other factor that I think is really important to understanding the extent of Forrest's legacy is that a Confederate apologist can basically make of him whatever they want. He didn't give a ton of interviews or speeches, at least not ones that were written down and preserved. He was almost certainly mostly illiterate, which means there aren't letters and journals to help us understand what was on his mind. So for those who just want to see him as a military genius, they can look at his clever tactics in the small battles that he was able to conduct off around the edges of the main theaters of war. And there are no pesky records of his thoughts popping up to definitively say, oh, and he was also a hateful SOB. For those who want to find some kind of winner in the Confederate war effort, they can point to the victories Forrest kept racking up after the South started to otherwise lose the war. Never mind that, again, those battles didn't matter much. All too many people will try to say Forrest came to see black people as equals because of one of his few speeches that was recorded. Brief, polite remarks delivered near the end of his life at a picnic put on by black folks. Never mind that at that point in his life, he was once again living in poverty. He was quite sick with diabetes. He was just generally in the kind of pitiful and powerless position that can inspire a last gasp of end-of-life contrition. There are also indications that he agreed to the appearance to try and court the black vote for white Democrats who were starting to realize just how outnumbered they potentially were at the polls in Memphis. However you want to look at the speech, it's a pretty strong overreach to hold it up as any kind of trustworthy indication that Forrest had truly come around out of love and tenderheartedness. Why does any of this matter? Well, as I said, his memory just won't stop haunting us. In recent years, MTSU has tried repeatedly to change the name of its Army ROTC building, Forrest Hall. So far, the state has not let them, calling it a historic memorial. The state makes it very hard to change historic memorials, and the law that puts up all those hurdles was passed out of anger that the city of Memphis removed a statue of, you guessed it, Nathan Bedford Forrest from a city park. In the discussion over that statue, or the MTSU building's name, or removing the bust of Forrest from the State House, a talking point that often emerges is the idea that removing an honor to an ugly piece of the past is ignoring or covering up history in some way. Okay, so what history is that? Like I said, we don't have many words from him to go by, so the only other thing to do is to look at his actions. Actions like the way that he operated an inhumane slave yard that sold human beings literally down the river. One of his newspaper ads boasted that he ran a jail that could hold 300 men, who that ad described as fresh supplies of likely young Negroes. He was particularly ruthless, known around the city for delivering exceptionally brutal public whippings, and is believed to have engaged in the illegal import of laborers directly from Africa. Or perhaps we could look at his actions during the massacre of Fort Pillow, when his troops gunned down 300 mostly black Union soldiers who, by many accounts, had already clearly surrendered. Another option is to go by what people who knew him said about Forrest. In 1879, a man who served under Forrest at the end of the Civil War gave a speech in Clarksville. This guy was a major fan of his former general, praising him up and down. But the things he said to show what a great guy Forrest was would, I think, give most of us pause. He boasted that Forrest's lack of education was a plus, saying, quote, "He was restrained by no knowledge of law or constitution. His favorite maxim was war means fighting and fighting means killing." He said Forrest, and this is a direct quote, owed his success to knowing when to dispense with the rules of war. He's basically calling the guy a war criminal while suggesting that's a good thing. As for the KKK, that shadowy terror group that Forrest denied in that Ohio interview, I've read a lot of accounts from his contemporaries. I think there's a good case to be made that Forrest was pro-Klan, that he was very aware of his reality, but that he wasn't directly involved in any substantial way. He basically lost all of his money in the war, and the only line of civilian work he'd ever succeeded in was eliminated by emancipation. His time and energy were spent scrambling for a way to make a dime. But that doesn't clean his reputation, even where the KKK is involved. Several sources suggest that the initial group that founded the Klan in Pulaski included men who had served directly under Forrest during the war. You can see echoes of his guerrilla military tactics in their actions. It was probably an honor given at a distance, but they did name him their Grand Wizard. And in 1869, he did order them to disband. Yes, after swearing that the KKK was imaginary, he signed a document urging its members to take off their white hoods. Let's just be clear, though. That order does not mean he thought they were wrong. The political winds had changed direction. Tennessee was close to the point of restoring the right to vote to former Confederates. Southern power brokers no longer found it politically convenient to have roaming groups of vigilantes getting in the way of restoring some degree of normalcy. All of this, is the history that is bound up in the name Forrest. Does that sign on the outside of MTSU's ROTC building convey even a piece of that long list of historical items? Did a regal equestrian statue give a sense of the fullness of who he was? We are far from finishing the task of reckoning with the way that the Confederacy marked Tennessee, or the way that monuments erected in the 20th century oversimplify the 19th century actions of Forrest and people like him. There will be many more accusations of erasing history as our communities keep questioning whether we should keep monuments, markers, and place names. As we have these conversations again and again, I just hope that if we're evoking history as a thing to be remembered and understood, that we do our best to really be honest and clear-eyed about what that history is.
Nina also loves to draw attention to little Nashville things that are hiding in plain sight. On June 4th, she did just that, pointing out why herds of goats were appearing on greenways around the city this summer. Here's our third and final essay from Nina.
It's June 4th, 2024. On this day in 1855, a U.S. Army major set out on a very unusual mission. Henry Wayne was tasked with traveling overseas in a specially outfitted ship to find and buy camels. The Army was having some trouble navigating the deserts of the southwestern territories, and a small group of officers, including Wayne, were convinced that camel trains would solve their problems. Congress appropriated $30,000 to establish the U.S. Camel Corps. Wayne first traveled to London and Paris to interview zookeepers there to learn more about caring for the animals. Not that the French and British were particularly renowned for their camel husbandry, but okay. Then he traveled around the Mediterranean, and his inexperience played out like you might expect. 2 of the first 3 camels he bought in Tunisia were infected with mange. He had trouble getting the necessary export permits. But eventually, Wayne did procure 33 animals and hired 5 experienced camel handlers to come to America. He set up a camp in San Antonio as a home base for the Corps, and eventually the camels were used for surveying expeditions. But the Civil War ended the experiment, and the herd was eventually retired in Southern California and auctioned off to circuses, private ranches, and mine operators. I'm Nina Cardona, and this is your daily digest of what's happening around Middle Tennessee from Nashville Public Radio, WPLN News. I'm pretty sure I've never seen a working camel here in Middle Tennessee, but every so often the folks at Nashville Public Radio get pretty excited by another kind of animal at work. Word will spread in the halls and on Slack, the goats are back! You see, our station is in Metro Center, and a lot of people like to use their lunch break to walk on the greenway that's on top of the river levee around the office park. And the grass on the steep side of the levee has occasionally been nibbled down to the ground by a herd of goats. Metro started using goats in some of these hard-to-mow areas back in 2015. Before that, landscape crews would spend hours with weed eaters because the slope was too steep to safely use mowers. And honestly, even the weed eaters seem like a lot to manage there. It's really steep. I can't imagine trying to navigate that slope with anything in my hands at all. But goats are literally made for that kind of landscape, as are sheep. And yes, some years Metro Water hires a herd of them instead. Locally, the city government was an early adopter of this kind of landscape maintenance. But these days, there are a few local companies offering the service. They advertise their herds as a way to cut the brush down from 5 or 6 feet high to basically nothing, all while adding natural, fertilizer. You know, manure, fresh from the source. A solar-powered electric fence keeps them within bounds. In some cases, a dog helps keep the goats or sheep in line. It's a growing trend nationwide, too, and some folks believe it brings benefits beyond the obvious ones of safety, decreased noise pollution, soil improvement, and less use of gas-powered implements. Right now, researchers at the University of California are working to quantify the myriad effects of using animals to mow grass, including the social and mental health effects of being around those sheep and goats. They're asking if the sheep and goats make us happier, if they create a deeper sense of place and community. Which, again, just makes me think about the excitement around the station when someone spots the goats back on the Metro Center Greenway. We're all smiling at the thought of it, taking pictures, sharing them to the group. And I have to think we're not the only workplace in the office park that's having that experience.
I hope you've enjoyed our special year-end episodes of the NashVillager. Nina will be back here tomorrow with another essay that's sure to change how you see our slice of Tennessee. Thanks for listening, and Happy New Year.